Right. Welcome, everyone. This is Suarez. This is the Arden Arcade Community Planning Advisory Council, 28th. Clerk, would you call the meeting to order, please? Right. Meeting has been called. Clerk, can you please call the roll?
I'm not sure. Hi, this is Florence Evans with the clerk of the board. I'm not sure if we have some technical difficulty, so I'll just call the roll and get us going until James can join us again.
Okay, that's not a problem. I can, you know what? How about?
I do apologize about that.
Oh, there we go.
My mic wasn't working for some reason.
Okay, James, I'll let you take over, dear.
All right. Thank you, Florence. So first here, yes. So Member Biller.
Present.
And Member Schiff.
Present.
Member Skvarla.
Present.
Member Turner.
Present.
Member Roten.
Present.
And Chairperson Suarez.
Present.
Right, and that is a full quorum.
I'd like to ask you all to take a moment and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Before we go into the Cpac announcements, let's go around and introduce. This is Colin Suarez, your chair. Is it Arden Arcade Cpac volunteer position? We are made up of your neighbors and member of your community to provide advice and planning commission of the county, as well as the board in full. No decision that is made here tonight is final, but our advisory comments are passed along for the final decision. I want to remember that we're all in this working together. Be polite, kind as you would be to any of your other neighbors. All right, next. So I'm Colin Suarez. I'm the chair. I live in the Arden Park neighborhood, and I have been a member of the Cpac for about a little over 3 years now. Mr. Schiff.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Damian Schiff. I live with my family in the Del Norte Woods section of Arden Arcade, and I have also been on the Cpac for about 3 years.
For Biller.
Bo Biller, relatively recent appointee, and I'm in the Sierra Oaks neighborhood. Thank you.
Member Skvarla. Member Skvarla, did we lose you?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Mikhail Skvarla, I'm a fairly new appointee to the board, in the Arden Park area.
Right. Member Turner.
Steve Turner, I've been on the board a little over 3 years. Worked here for 30 years, retiring as a battalion chief with Metro Fire. I live in the Sierra Oaks Vista neighborhood.
All right, thank you. And last, but certainly not least, Member Roten.
Thank you. Tom Roten here. I've been on the Cpac about 5 years, I think now, and I live in the Del Paso Manor neighborhood. Welcome.
All right. Thank you again for all participating. Full house. All right. Clerk, do you have any announcements for the Cpac?
Yes. So this meeting is live streamed and temporarily closed to in-person public participation. The clerk's office is in the process of hosting hybrid public meetings that will provide board members and members of the public with the option to participate in the meeting, either in person or remotely. Thank you for your patience and support. To make a verbal comment at today's meeting, dial 916-875 2501 to provide your contact information. When the chair opens public comment for a specific agenda item or off-agenda matter, callers will be contacted by phone and transferred into the meeting to make their public comment. Written comments are always accepted. You can send your email comment to boardclerk@saccounty.net. Your comment will be routed to the board and filed in the record. And that ends our announcement.
All right, thank you very much. So with all that having been done, let's move to the agendized items we have. Right. Item 1 is re-envision West Arden Arcade Sustainable Communities and Plan Area. Do we have Christy or of the Planning Commission who's here?
I'm here. Christy Graybo, project manager, is here. So I'll go ahead and start my presentation when the PowerPoint is pulled up.
Thank you.
Hey, good evening. My name is Christy Graybo, associate planner for the county and the project manager for this re-envision West Arden Arcade Sustainable Communities and Complete Streets plan. Next slide. Before we start this presentation and dive into the plan, please know that this document is a long-range visioning plan and will not result in any construction project, change of current street design, or zoning on any property. As a visioning plan, this sets in writing what the community would like to see and partnering with consultants to design what could be possible. In order for any of these ideas shown to you tonight or in the plan to be built, there are additional studies, public outreach, and entitlements or projects that need to occur. So let's go ahead and start. This plan is bounded by Cottage Way on the north, Northrop Avenue on the south, Howe Avenue on the west, and Watt Avenue on the east. This plan looks at providing comfortable, connected, and accessible facilities for all users. It tries to balance multimodal, which are modes of transportation, like driving, walking, or rolling operations through innovative designs, and tries to promote safety for all modes. It looks at trying to increase economic opportunities for local existing business. And lastly, it could address sustainability and equity by providing transportation options. Next slide. Here's a snapshot of the project timeline. We kicked off this project in spring of 2020. And then we hosted most of the public outreach in summer and fall and a little bit into the winter of 2020. And we have been developing the plan most of this year. This plan is on a Caltrans grant timeline, and this project has to have action taken by the Board of Supervisors by February of 2022. Next slide. This slide is here to show how this plan overlaps with the other county initiatives that are currently on their way, such as the countywide climate action plan and the Arden Way master plan and the active transportation plan. Next slide. Public engagement was a large component of the development of this plan, and we wanted to list out other community groups that we connected with in 2020. Most of those were during our virtual workshops that hosted stakeholder listening sessions. We broke them into groups such as park districts, local school representatives, business owners, chamber of commerce, and community-based organizations. We also provided an online survey available in 6 different languages and created a lesson plan for teachers in the local schools with a separate survey to understand the perspective of kids in the community. Next slide. And here's what we heard. It's that the community is and values its diversity, would love to see opportunities for local businesses and current residents to thrive. There's a desire for a vibrant neighborhood with a strong identity, and they want a safe, more comfortable, and accessible public realm, and they want improved accessibility for all modes, ages, and abilities. Next slide. So based on those comments that we heard, we use them for our design directives when drafting up the plan. For example, what does it mean to create comfortable, safe, and accessible places to walk or roll? Maybe it's separated bike lanes away from pedestrians and cars, like the photos on the left. And creating spaces for more shade, that might mean ideas like the photos on the right with tree-lined streets. Next slide. Creating a sense of community identity could be public art, and that looks in a couple different forms, like the wall art in the photos, or street art, or archways like the photos on the left. Lastly, creating nodes or pockets of activity in the community with cohesive connections like connected bike trails or wider sidewalks. Next slide. When designing out the streets, the project team applied these elements to consider the most vulnerable users first, think beyond ADA compliance, and employ best practices of universal design, and to consider safety, comfort, accessibility, and look at the user's experience. Next slide. Can you hit the next slide, please? There you go. Ooh, sorry. Can you go back one more? Okay, while that's going on, this plan created a place-based network of streets that again looked at people first and strived to be walkable, bikeable, and overall inviting. It also identified opportunities for co-benefits like placemaking and worked with existing assets. This plan is trying to achieve moving away from being auto-dependent to inviting more users to these corridors. The plan on the next few slides are examples of ways to preserve the existing traffic flow while encouraging redesigning of these streets to be more comfortable and accessible for other users. So we broke up the 10 main corridors or roads into 3 categories: neighborhood connectors, parkway, and commercial corridors. Next slide. The streets identified as neighborhood connectors are Cottage Way, Bell Street, Northrop Avenue, Hurley Way, and Morris Avenue. These are the local streets with lower traffic volumes than the commercial corridors and are mostly residential. Next slide. In this plan, neighborhood connectors should maximize sidewalk spaces to make it more comfortable and accessible for pedestrians to travel. These streets should provide landscape buffers when possible to create shade for cooler environments and make it safer. On this slide, we have Bell Street, which has most of the community's schools and connects to the nearby parks. This plan utilizes the same single lane of traffic each way and looks at removing some street parking to be able to provide a separated 2-way bike lane, wider sidewalks, and more street trees. Next slide. This slide shows examples of those type of facilities in other cities as real-life examples. Next slide. The street identified as a parkway is Alta Arden Expressway. A little background behind this street is that it was historically designated as a Sacramento County freeway expressway to help alleviate traffic from Arden Way. The county purchased the access rights from almost all the adjacent property owners prior to the construction of the street. Although the freeway expressway designation still applies to Alta Arden in the general plan, Arden Way remains the primary choice for vehicular traffic, and Alta Arden is not used to its full intended potential. Next slide. As an alternative, this plan presents a concept to transform this freeway expressway corridor into a green space parkway while still providing for vehicular traffic. Full execution of this conceptual plan would require further studies, additional public outreach, and amendment to the general plan to recharacterize Alta Arden Expressway. This slide identifies how it could still accommodate 4 lanes of traffic with a separated 2-way bike lane and 2 wider pedestrian sidewalks with a lot more landscape and trees. A quick comment about this design is that we heard a potential concern about an increase of persons experiencing homelessness. However, with an increase of people using alternative modes of transportation like walking or biking or rolling in these corridors, there could be more eyes on the area and on the road, and that could potentially deter various types of activities. Next slide. This slide shows a few examples of parkway designs elsewhere in the country, just as an example. And next slide. Commercial corridors are the main streets that connect residents and visitors to the businesses within the project area. And those 4 main streets in this plan area are Howe Avenue, Fulton Avenue, Arden Way, and Watt Avenue. The plan does not include recommendations for these commercial corridors, but includes concepts for a starting point of discussion of what could be. This was because the project team heard concerns about implementing lane reductions due to the concern of increasing traffic, especially on 2 of the very few north-south river crossings that connect southern Sacramento County to northern Sacramento and Placer counties, and potentially restricting or impacting access to existing businesses along these streets. Those ideas can be found in Chapter 5 of this plan. Next slide. So this plan also looked at land use and the built form of the community to promote walkability and to create active, well-used, and safe places for residents and visitors. It includes a set of design principles, such as orienting the building entrances to sidewalks, shaping new buildings to create a public space like small parks, creating community spaces within large blocks, and screening the parking lots. Then the plan created 2 sets of nodes. For example, this map on the screen is of the existing road section of Arden Way from Watt to Morris Avenue. If we implemented the town center node from this plan, it would be considered a regional mixed-use designation as a gateway into the plan area. Next slide. This slide shows an example of what could be at the same area if the land use portion of the plan was implemented. The large parking lots of existing commercial could be used to develop a wide range of mixed-use projects with more public spaces for community gathering, while still preserving the existing businesses. By building closer to the street, the alternative mode users, like walkers, bikers, or those rolling, can also access the businesses easier instead of having to cross large areas of parking lots. Next slide. And here's just an example of the street view of that same node to show an increase of street trees and more space to encourage people onto Arden Way. Next slide. Here's a photo of Fulton and Hurley intersection. It was identified as a potential neighborhood node that would be serving as local designations for retail, amenities, and services. This again is another example of, next slide. So this slide is another example of implementing the plan. It could create a type of node that would preserve the existing businesses and some of the parking to support those existing businesses, but also use the underutilized parking and setback areas to create, for example, a community garden. That's the area near Howe in this photo, and more opportunities for small or medium scale residential or mixed use projects and new smaller footprint commercial buildings. Next slide. Here's a street view of Fulton with more street trees and walkable, rollable spaces. Again, these are just ideas for visioning, and there are additional studies and public outreach and entitlement or projects that need to be required before anything like this or anything else in the plan happens in the community. So next slide. The staff is here tonight to ask for a recommendation from the Cpac to make a recommendation to approval to the Planning Commission to approve the Re-envision West Arden Arcade Sustainable Communities and Complete Streets Plan as a long-term visioning document. And that concludes staff's presentation. I have with me tonight Cameron Shrew from the Department of Transportation, if there are any traffic-specific questions, and Leanne Mueller is my senior to assist with any plan-related questions. I think that's it. Any questions?
All right. Thank you, Christy. So, Chair Prerogative, just really quickly, I want to make sure we give everyone, but I know there would like to be a back and forth, but we can get into if there's follow-up questions, but I'd like to go one at a time. So if any one of the members of the board would like to holler first with a question for the board, for the Planning Commission or for the folks from Transportation. Any comments or questions from the board?
Yeah, so this is Member Scavarla. I was just curious, with regards to a long-term visioning document, and pardon my, I'm new here. What does that? Are there any impositions on development or anything like that at this point, or is this kind of just setting can you walk me through kind of what the purpose of the document is, other than setting a vision? Are there next steps that need to take place with regard to zoning and other things like that, and how do those steps take place? What's the sequencing here?
Sure, that's a great question. So this plan is a grant-funded project And what this does is it sets the foundation for having a conversation with the community and the county to hear their thoughts on what they would like to see when it comes to improving these corridors to have more people on the streets, whether it be walking, rolling, or anything like that. But it's basically just a planning study, a planning document that we have on file that'll say, here's the kind of conversations that we've had with the community. But it doesn't change anything directly to any development. Maybe, Cameron, if you can speak to a little bit more if there's anything that goes with development of streets or anything like that. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done before anything happens on that.
Yeah, this is Cameron Chu with the Department of Transportation. Yeah, as Christy said, this document is just a first step. It's a visioning document, and it would be used to potentially be able to go after more grants and potentially able to fund some of these ideas, just to show that the foundation's in place and the outreach has already been started. Yeah,
Oh, thanks. I think what you guys put together here, I mean, it looks great, and interested in learning what your decided next steps are.
All right, thank you, Member Scavarla. Any other comments or questions from the board?
Yes, this is Damien Schiff. I have a follow-up question about the significance of the plan. Once the plan is approved, does it mean that if one were to propose a project in the plan area that were inconsistent with the plan, does that mean that that proposal is less likely to be approved or is less likely to be eligible for any sort of funding?
So to answer your question, no, this doesn't change any development standards or anything with land use or anything like that. Potentially a planner could pull it and say it's an idea of what was said with the community, and here they can give it to a developer for suggestions, but it won't stop any development to happen because of this plan coming through.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions from the board? Okay, hearing none. I have a couple of questions. So I know you said as part of the conversation about these corridors that we're going to try and keep their and maintain traffic flow. Any prescribed or potential reduction in vehicle miles traveled even thrown out as a concept anywhere in this document?
Maybe Cameron can answer. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Cameron Chu, the Department of Transportation. Certainly on the land use side, when you change land use development patterns over time, that does have an effect on VMT. Then on the roadway side, typically when you have lane reductions or road diets, you would see a decrease in VMT associated with that change. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Is there any reductions in lane miles prescribed in this plan?
Well, I think that some of the visions that were proposed in the plan, for example, on Alta Arden Expressway, where it envisions a single travel lane in both directions, would be a lane reduction beyond what we have today that's out there. That's one example.
Actually, Alta Arden has two ways on both sides. They're just divided up by some of the walkways and stuff, but there's still examples. So sorry, Cameron.
Oh yeah, and in the longer term visioning, some of the concepts that were presented there looked at potential lane reductions on Watt Avenue and Howe Avenue in Fulton Avenue. The Department of Transportation has given some feedback that's in the document that based on the traffic volumes we see today, we don't see those as realistic reductions at this time, but we didn't object to keeping them in the document for future consideration.
And also reasoning why they're separated from the rest of the recommendations from the rest of the plan also.
Okay. And then, I'm thinking of projects like the concept around the Fulton I'm very familiar with that particular intersection. And I've noticed a lot of these corridors, to the point that was apparently raised in your conversation. There's a lot of these corridors that have issues with calls to service, individuals in various different states, and mental distress in those who are essentially living along these corridors. Have you talked to anyone from the sheriff's office about an overlay of where some of these, areas with highest calls to service are, so that we actually know what the potential impacts could be, folks taking advantage of these nice new pretty parkways?
So no, we actually, that was not part of this this plan. I think that kind of lends itself to, if these ideas get further along the line, more studies will be required, and more outreach will be required before any of this gets developed.
Okay. And that was all I had. Any other questions or comments from the board?
This is
Hearing none.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Chair. I do actually have a question. I mean, the plan does seem to be strongly in favor of encouraging more opportunities for bicyclists and bicycling. And I noticed in the plan that there's this comfort typology of bicyclists, and that according to the percentages given, that a little more than half of the general public are, quote, interested but concerned about bicycling, and that the plan is catered to that segment. But I'm curious as to whether we have any reason to believe that that percentage of 50+% is representative of the preferences of the people who live in this particular area, or is it just an assumption that the residents here would fall more than half into wanting more biking opportunities, as opposed to, it appears that a third of the general public don't want to bicycle at all? My concern is just, what if it turns out that actually in this area that more than half the people don't really care about bicycling, and then we have a plan that somewhat undemocratically, forces that particular preference on them?
That's a good question. I would have to say, the answer to the percentages that you had in there, that's response to the survey. So the people that we reached out to and tried to connect with and answered, I would, in hopes to answer the people that answered the survey, 50% wanted to bike or were encouraged to wanting to do that type of mode of transportation. So that's where that 50% number comes from. Wasn't hypothetical. Also, too, this is an EJ community, so I don't know, off the top of my head, I can't recall. I know that it's not going to be like a two-car family situation, so other modes of transportation are important for some of these residents in here. So that's why it was important to lean on looking at other opportunities.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Christy. Much appreciated for the feedback. At this time, we would like to open it up to comment. So I would like to point out that while we're taking public comment, we are asking that you hold your comments to 2 minutes or less. In addition, as the clerk said, you are free to put a detailed comment to the board in the form of an email. So keep that in mind as well, in case you're running near the end of time and felt as though you haven't got your full statement in. So with that having been said, clerk, do we have any public comments on?
We do not have any public comments in the queue.
Well, then I said all that for nothing. Okay. Unless there's anything else, I would be willing to make a motion to move for consideration of the visioning plan as proposed by the county. Do I have a second?
Steve Turner, I'll give you your second.
Thank you, Member Turner. All right. A first and second having been made, clerk, would you please call the roll?
Yes. Member Biller.
Sorry, Biller, aye.
All right. And then Member Schiff,
Aye.
Member Scarla,
Aye.
Member Turner,
Aye.
Member Roten,
Aye.
and Chair Suarez.
Aye.
Right. And that is a unanimous vote.
All right. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 2, a zoning ordinance amendment to mitigate impacts from COVID-19 to supply chains and to construction and development activities. You see, we have lead planner Wendy Hartman. Is Ms. Hartman available to present?
I am. Good evening, everyone.
Okay,
Thank you for bringing up my PowerPoint presentation. So this is a zoning ordinance amendment to mitigate impacts from COVID-19. Next slide, please. On May 5th of 2020, the County Board of Supervisors adopted an urgency ordinance amending the county zoning code, as well as several other county provisions related to COVID. At that time, the urgency ordinance wasn't just for issuances of emergency temporary use permits. There were also provisions in the urgency ordinance related to building permit extensions of time, as well as some other items affecting other departments. The item before you tonight is focusing just on the item pertaining to the zoning code update that is needed. So this ordinance amendment will add section 3.10.3.k as a permanent provision within our zoning code. It allows for the issuance of emergency temporary use permits whenever there is a state or board of supervisor declared emergency that directly affects Sacramento County. These emergency temporary use permits are most typically issued at an administrative level. There are provisions in the zoning code section for when an action would require board authority. And we did have a couple of them last year that did go back through the board for a recommendation. One of them was for Siemens, who manufactures rail cars, and they were having some issues with good movement, and they needed a temporary staging area. The board also gave us last year blanket authorization for temporary outdoor dining areas for restaurants. So the purpose of this amendment is that COVID is not going away anytime soon, but we also wanted to make sure that we're prepared for any future disasters that could occur. Many of our surrounding counties and communities have experienced devastating fires or floods, and this would put us in a position that if other tragic events were to occur, we would be able to quickly issue permits for things such as temporary housing or ability to reside in RVs on areas that we wouldn't typically allow for them given a certain type of event. So it gives us a lot of flexibility in issuing emergency temporary use permits whenever there is a declared emergency. So with that, so the language that was attached in your packet shows the changes that will be made to our zoning code as it currently stands today. And there are just a few minor changes from the original text that the board adopted on May 5th, 2020, primarily related to our ability to allow for extensions of emergency temporary use permits. Back in May of 2020, we would have never imagined that COVID would be still going on 18 months later. And so we had much stricter requirements around the timelines that we could extend a emergency temporary use permit. So we provided some additional flexibility in the expiration dates of ETUZs, so long as there is still a local emergency in place. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right. Ms. Hartman, Any questions or comments from the board? Okay, I have a couple of questions. Do we know how many temporary use of property permits were issued within the CPACs during the pandemic?
No, I do not. One of the reasons for that was initially we were requiring every restaurant or a small period of time, personal services to each get their own individual emergency temporary use permit. And it was problematic for staff to process those. We ended up processing about a dozen of them within a very short time period. And that is why we went back to the board and allowed for some blanket guidance. So the way it works for the restaurants and those types of bars, things of that nature that have temporary outdoor dining areas, is that we worked with the building department, code enforcement, fire, and environmental management, and drafted guidance documents on how they needed to operate. And then essentially code enforcement, when they noticed someone was maybe not operating properly, would go and have a conversation with them and give them the guidance document to try to help them stay in compliance. And then we did have probably another dozen or so ETZs issued primarily for private schools and convalescent facilities to add temporary structures to give them the ability to have students more socially distanced, and then for the senior living facilities to provide common areas where they could kind of disperse a little bit more.
Okay. I'll also say I'm a little bit concerned about the language.
I'm sorry?
I'm a little bit concerned about the language, and
Okay.
maybe there's a simple, but my concern is that, temporary use of property for the sake of emergency has traditionally been limited to pressing, immediate, relatively temporary emergency.
Mm-hmm.
The authorities granted to the board in this new language is fairly broad and has fairly few restrictions. I mean, normal emergencies, strikes, lockouts, riots, act of war, epidemics,
Mm-hmm.
acts of government, emergency declarations, of which I've seen a whole host of which the emergency in question is questionable. Fire, power failures, nuclear accidents, earthquake, unusually severe terrorism, unusually severe weather, acts of terrorism, or other disasters. I'm part of my concern is sitting there going, okay, proposed use of property to support emergency response efforts, mitigate impacts of, but with no end timeline on the emergency. Let's say if the board was to declare a public health emergency from unhoused individuals in the Arden Arcade community, what is to stop the board from also then saying, per 310.3, using this parking lot in this strip mall as a temporary shelter for the length of the declared emergency is absolutely justified. And so you've essentially set up, instead of a FEMA shelter, what could be a long-lasting pseudo residential territory being waved away with the simple justification of, well, it was an emergency declaration and it's to support the emergency response efforts or to mitigate impacts of that emergency. Am I completely off base on that? Or is that would that be applicable under the read of this code?
I don't believe the board, when approving, because this is the language that they previously approved, I don't recall ever homelessness being brought up as being under this. I would have to ask one of our legal counsel if that could apply, but it was not the intent when the board initially adopted this language.
Well, I mean, there are not necessary responses to longer term emergencies like pandemics that we're now having to justify with. But I would be very interested and would like to see a response from county council, because this is a very broad authority. And the number of things that can be a declared emergency that I have seen both the county and particularly the governor declare over the last several years still boggles my mind. So because it is such a broad authority, I would like some guidance from county council as to what they're. All right. Are there any other questions or comments from the board?
Yes, this is
Members.
Damien Chip. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Mr. Chair.
Oh, okay. Thank you. No, I just so I general understanding of what's being proposed here. Would this be something that would simply allow the board to authorize uses of property that might not otherwise be authorized? Or would it also be a power that would allow the board to limit uses of property that might otherwise be allowable? I guess what I'm saying is this simply a way to allow more property to be used in a certain way, or does it contain any limitations that otherwise might not apply?
I would say it's probably a little bit of both. So, for example, right now in our regular zoning code, outside of our provisions for temporary outdoor dining and the recently passed legislation from the governor, we wouldn't typically allow businesses to have dining out in their parking lots. So these provisions are allowing for some expansion of uses that wouldn't typically be allowed. In the example of our surrounding jurisdictions that have had horrible fires, it would allow for folks to potentially allow someone to live on their property temporarily in an RV while they were trying to get, permanent shelter set up, things of that nature. So it does expand on uses that in normal circumstances would not be allowed. There are some limitations on what the planning director can approve without sending it to the board for direction.
Okay, I share to some extent the chair's concerns about a very broad emergency power, but I would note that I think some of the concerns that have been raised about government responses, emergency powers during the COVID pandemic have been based more upon how these emergency powers authorize extraordinary regulatory power, not so much that they allow people to do things that otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to do. But I would also share the chair's concern about maybe tightening up the language for what would qualify as an emergency, and perhaps having input from county council on that, I think would be helpful.
Okay.
Mr. Cavarla, I believe you wanted to comment?
Yeah, as presented, I'm thinking about parklets and other things along those lines, which I think were a great benefit and something that I think we should consider keeping long term. However, I think the points of the chair are also well taken, and that perhaps a stronger definition of emergency may need to be contemplated, especially with the kind of broad-ranging authority that's been applied by multiple administrations, both governors and elsewhere.
Right, Matt. Any other comments or questions from the board? Okay, hearing none. Clerk, do we have any public comments on this item?
We do not have any public comments in the queue for this item.
Okay. So, I guess what you're looking for as the action here, vote of support for the items as amended in county code, is that correct?
This is a workshop item, so there actually is no formal action.
Oh, okay. Well, then that makes it very
Yeah,
easy.
You are the only Cpac that asked for a presentation.
All right. Well,
All
thank you
right,
very much.
good.
Cool. Okay. Well, if that is the case, well then thank you, County, for presenting.
All right.
And now moving on to the staff clerk.
We do not have any staff updates on our end, I don't believe.
Right. Are there any comments on non-agendized items that any member of the Cpac would like to make? Okay. None. Do we have any public comments for non-agendized items?
I believe so. Give me one moment.
Okay, are you ready for your public comment for item 5?
Yes. If we haven't, how many public comments do we have in the queue?
You have one caller in queue so far, and I have Miss Jennifer on the line right now. She's ready for her comment.
Okay. You can let her know she has 2 minutes for comment.
Okay, Jennifer, you have 2 minutes to make your comments. If you can start with your comments now, that would be great.
Thank you so much for hearing my comment this evening, and thank you for serving on the Cpac board. My concern is I have a couple of sections of Marconi Avenue that are difficult to walk on. There's no sidewalk, and that would be between Watt Avenue and Morse on the south side of the street. So we have a small walking group that walks every month. It's called Walk the Square. And if we had any sort of folks in wheelchairs, it would be totally, even more dangerous than it is now. But I have brought this up and asked by way of email, but it just hasn't made it to the meetings yet since we've been delaying for COVID and such. But I will send an email with more information so that the board will have a chance to look exactly at the parts of Marconi that I'm talking about. And I encourage you, please, to join us if you'd like to see ground side view or a ground view of what it's actually like to walk that area. And bear in mind that that's an RT line, so we're expecting folks to be able to successfully use RT and walk in the area too. So I also encourage you and I challenge you each to step on an RT bus frequently. We're talking about a lot of transportation issues involving our bus line. So that's my challenge to you. And I, again, thank each of you and appreciate you for your work and your decision making that you do here. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I will go ahead and end the call now. And that concludes your callers. And I do want to point out to the board that Ms. Jennifer had also submitted a written comment, and we did distribute that via email, and that will get published after the meeting. Being that it is off agenda, we'll get that published onto the webpage there for your meeting webpage.
All right, thank you. Okay, seeing no other items, Chair would smile upon a motion for adjournment.
I'd make a motion to adjourn. Tom here.
Thank you, Member Roden. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Member Scavarla. We are adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone. Always appreciated.
Thank you.
Bye.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.